So have you heard the one about the witch that goes to church? That can sound like the beginning to some kind of a joke, can't it? I've had a lot of my viewers ask me questions about Unitarian Universalism. So you'll be interested in this video if you're interested in learning more about being a UU, or what a UU is, what a UU believes and does, or if you're just curious to know about that aspect of who I am. Let me tell you a little story about how I came to be a Unitarian Universalist to begin with. I was in my 40s, and a friend of mine who was a Druid who was very active in the Charleston UU church told me she thought I needed to visit my local UU church. And of course my response was, I don't think so. I had no desire, hadn't had a desire since I was a teenager for anything that seemed like organized religion. But my friend said to me, and she was right, by the way, I'd come to a point in my life where I needed a wider sense of community. I had the good fortune of being in a coven at the time and had been in my first coven for over a decade prior to that. So I wasn't a lonely pagan. I had community, but I had this small cloistered community of 13. And her advice was, she was an older woman than I, very active in the wider community, both pagan and ecumenical, and that I needed to push myself to extend myself into the wider world when it came to who I was spiritually and what I wanted to manifest in the world. I only went to that UU church for my first visitation because she is someone I respected deeply. What she said mattered to me. So I decided to visit our local Unitarian Universalist church. At the time it was meeting actually in a Chinese American community center. They didn't have a building of their own yet. And I remember, as I got to the front door, I froze in place thinking, I swore I'd never, for my own reasons, not avoiding people's weddings or baptisms or things, but my own reasons, step foot over the threshold of a church again. And I had a moment of panic, and there was somebody on the other side that said, oh, hi, welcome, I don't think I recognize you. And I have such good manners that I had to step in. Now, one of the reasons my friend had encouraged me to visit the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship is their welcoming attitude towards the pagan path, actually towards all paths. And she thought it was time I come out of the closet in a way. This is about 20 years ago. And find a wider space in which all of who I was spiritually and all of what I believed in and all of which I was practiced was a part of what I was, that I didn't hide anything. Kind of a coming out of the closet, thinking of some of our recent discussions on that. So, it was a warm fellowship. A lot of great people who said hello and engaged me in conversation and made me feel really comfortable and asked me what my background was. You know, was I UU, and if not, what was my background? And I remember it was the first time in a non-pagan group I said, my background is I'm a Wiccan. And they didn't know what that meant, so they asked me, well, what does that mean? And I said, well, I follow a goddess-centered, earth-based spiritual practice. And it was like, oh, wow, well, one of our principles honors the wisdom of that path. And welcome. We don't really have anybody like you here, but we're really glad that you're here. I was the first Wiccan for most of them, but I think for almost all of them at the time. And there ended up being a handful of people in the church who knew what that was, but hadn't met them yet. And the first thing I remember enjoying the service, and I was totally fascinated that when the minister finished her sermon, she opened the floor for conversation. The microphone was passed for people to agree or disagree with what she'd said. And that totally fascinated me. And then someone came up to me afterwards who had become an important loved one in my life, who had always hoped that she'd meet another Wiccan. And while we didn't actually talk about that part of who we were until we knew each other better, it made for a very warm feeling of welcome in the church. Well, not being the kind of person who joins without joining in, I became more and more involved with that fellowship over the next years and taught classes. I taught Rise Up and Call Her Name, a year-long curriculum to honor the feminine and divine. I began, and then led and co-led earth-based circles. We celebrated the Sabbats. And it goes from a witch walks into a church to there's a witch in the pulpit. I took on doing Sunday services and being in congregation from that perspective and looking out, and everything about my experience there was what my friend had encouraged me to experience. In fact, when we were thinking about moving, when we retired here, one of the things that caused me to consider whether I wanted to or not was the fact that I would have to leave that fellowship. It's too far away from here. It's a couple hours to drive. And as you may know from the vlogging I've shared recently, I have just joined our local Unitarian Universalist fellowship. In fact, a couple weeks ago. It took me a while when we retired to feel the urge for that kind of community again, because I was thinking nothing could replace the old one I was part of, and that's true in some ways. But today I went to a newcomer luncheon at my new church, and I came away feeling very warmed and feeling very much at home. So what's a Unitarian Universalist? A little bit of a history lesson for you, if I may, because there is a history to Unitarian Universalism. The Unitarian aspect of Unitarian Universalism goes back to the 1500s. It actually started in Transylvania. And in fact, the sister church to the church I've just joined is in Transylvania. And while the movement changed in some ways when it got to America, the commonality for the Unitarian aspect of Unitarian Universalism, the history there is a form of Christianity which did not believe in the Trinity, which saw Jesus from God or inspired by God, but not God himself. Unitarians did not believe that Jesus was to be worshipped. He was to be considered a teacher. He lived by example. He was a savior. He proved that there was the possibility of salvation, but he was not one with the Godhead. Now you can imagine at the time that was quite a heresy, quite a change in the view of it. There are still people today who do not consider Unitarians to be Christians because they think you can't be a Christian if you don't see Jesus as specifically of the Godhead, as part of the Trinity. The other thing that Unitarians didn't believe in, which obviously at the time you can imagine was quite something, they didn't believe in you becoming one with your religion or living your religion through the expression of creeds, of reciting words or principles or certain things. They thought that all religious writings were open to interpretation, so they kind of didn't, at some level, didn't trust religious writing because they were writings of man being fallible. But on the other hand, they did appreciate and used the Bible, but they didn't make it their be-all, end-all in the sense of it wasn't the final word. They believed in reason, and that you read, you let that sit with you, and they believed very powerfully in choice and free will, and you're making the decision whether those words resonated within you. Therefore, declaring a creed to them was an invalid religious statement, because a creed would only have value if you personally connected to it and chose it for yourself. Someone couldn't tell you to recite a creed and therefore you will be a certain religion. They didn't believe in original sin or predestination. Again, imagine in the times to hold those beliefs very different from the Christianity of the time. American Unitarian churches had a connection to that history. Specifically here, though, at the point in our histories in the 1700s when there was a revival of strict Puritanism, it caused those who had a Unitarian mindset, a Unitarian difference in belief, to be separating themselves farther from their Puritan brothers and sisters. They actually set themselves in opposition to the reformed, more strict aspect of Puritanism. All the things I mentioned are the reasons why they distanced themselves from that religious movement. And additionally, in the 1700s in America, a hinge point of what being a Unitarian meant was universal salvation. That everyone, no matter, had the potential for being saved. Unitarians, in general, founded the United States of America. Almost all the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Unitarian. That is why Unitarians don't tolerate very well those who use the Constitution or those early government documents as a way to bring God into law. It simply wasn't part of those documents as they were originally written. The Founding Fathers, most of whom were Unitarian, believed we all saw God in our own way. And importantly, that we all had the right to use our minds and our reason and determine what it is for us we could not be told. Somewhere, almost in the same time in the United States, Universalism was taking off. So we had Unitarianism and we had Universalism. Universalism was very similar to Unitarianism, except Unitarianism, while it promised universal salvation, still thought you had to go through a bit to get there. Universalism, still Christian, had a view that God was all loving, and there was no such thing as eternal damnation, purgatory, eternal punishment. It was not part of the process of salvation. So while the Unitarians believed in universal salvation, the Universalists took it a bit further, in that everyone, and including, as their religion grew, everyone of all faiths, would be welcomed at the end by a loving God. So there were great similarities between the two of them. The biggest difference, amongst others, but the biggest difference was this welcoming embrace of God that was equal and offered to everyone equal. In the times, it meant that freed slaves were members of Universalist churches. Not the slaves who were not freed, not yet, because they couldn't get to those churches. However, the Universalists were very active in the abolition movement in the United States. They were the first denomination, I know, in the United States, and I wish I knew my history better. It seems to me I've read in the world who ordained women ministers as Christian ministers. Interestingly, those women ministers went west. The Unitarians did not proselytize. They were rather quiet and closed within their ranks. Perhaps reasoned thinkers tend to be that way. The Universalists, though, felt very drawn to share the love of God as they knew it. And they did reach out to people, and reach out to congregations, and they were establishing new congregations, and they moved westward. And often it was women ministers that were those ministers that moved westward. Sometimes it was easier for the spinster minister to move westward than it was for the settled minister with family to move. Interestingly, I'll mention something later about famous Unitarian Universalists. You know the expression, "Go west, young man," that Horace Greeley, the great journalist, wrote? He was a Universalist. And there were some other famous Unitarians in early history and famous Universalists that are interesting. You can find them if you do a little research. The Universalists believed in a God who loved everyone. And they weren't so positive that it was the God that they knew. They actually gave credit, especially as time went by, to other religions' view of God as also being a possibility. They saw that he was present in all religions that could be expressed in loving ways, or at least the loving aspects of all religions. That is still a great part of Unitarian Universalist principles today, that aspect of universalism that is lasting truth, deep truth, is found in all religions. Maybe not all religions in their entirety, but in the particularly inspirational and wise aspects of all religions. So you had the Unitarians and you had the Universalists, and they were so similar in nature. The big difference being that the Universalists believed in a suffer-free salvation, even though the Unitarians believed all could be, if they chose to be, saved. Universalists felt we were kind of born saved and that we'd be welcomed to the whatever at the end. The two began in the 18th and the 19th centuries to work very, very closely together for social justice. Clara Barton, somebody that most of us in the United States studied when we were in school, they called her the angel of the battlefield. She nursed wounded and recovering and dying Civil War soldiers, was a Unitarian. And that is an example of their presence in society was often as doctors and healers and teachers. As early as the 1830s, and this is a note I have to myself, because maybe you can tell by the way I'm presenting this, I've taught a UU 101 class often, which is the beginnings of it, to help people consider the history of the Unitarian and the Universalists and how they came together and what they had in common. I've always found it fascinating that it was relatively early in the 1800s that they used not only the Bible, but other religious texts. We might not think much of that now, but think of that in the 1800s. And very interesting, in the 1900s, early in them, both of them had gotten to the point where they believed you could be a spiritual, even a religious person without believing in a specific God or even a God. It was the evolution of where they were going. They believed that truth was not knowable through a singular religious experience or teaching. The truth is out there from so many sources. They became more and more alike. And we move into contemporary times, and in 1961 they merged. They were the Unitarians and they were the Universalists, and then there became the Unitarian Universalists. And lots happened in the time since 1961. But you can see where the send-off was: loving God, wisdom from all religious sources, inspiration from all religious sources, even if one did not choose to believe in a specific deity or even in deity alone. So the Unitarian Universalists began including folks from all different faiths. Mind you, both Unitarians and Universalists had been Christian faiths, even though some other Christians would not have called them so because of their concept of Jesus as not divine himself. Buddhists and Hindus and Jews, agnostics and non-deists and humanists all started gathering under this umbrella of Unitarian Universalism. What they had in common was believing there was wisdom to be had in the teachings of all religions. They came together to explore that and experiment with that. All along they were extremely devoted to social justice, to activism in the community, to devotion to causes, shared causes, to exploring together what might be. And it got to a point where New Age philosophy and practices were included in part of that. Included in the sense of indigenous practices were considered to be as powerful as those from more organized mainstream religions. And there was a statement made in the 80s that included indigenous practices and earth-based practices as part of the sources of the wisdom that were the inspiration for Unitarian Universalist celebrations. There are principles and there are sources which inform Unitarian Universalist fellowships around the world. They are agreed worldwide. The umbrella organization is called the Unitarian Universalist Association, UUA.org. And the 7 principles and the sources are the things which probably most describe who we are. The interesting thing about them is we haven't lost the Unitarian philosophy. Words are written by another. Our responsibility towards them is to use our intellect and our reasoning and determine what the words mean for us. So when we're taught the principles as a Unitarian Universalist, they aren't a declaration of this is so. They are, what does this mean to you? Let me read the principles to you. I'm not such a good you that I can rattle them off. 1. The inherent worth and dignity of every person. 2. Justice, equality, and compassion in human relationships. 3. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growths in our congregations. It's that concept that when you come together, you can create something you really can't quite create alone. That's my reasoning on that one, at least. Number 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The responsible harkens back to think. Don't be told. Think what something is for you. The 5th principle is the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. UUs are often marching for something or another. They're effecting change. They work within a political environment to make things happen. They work in a social and activism environment to make things happen. The 6th principle, the goal of world community, the peace, liberty, and justice for all. This one's always the one that feels hokey for me. It sounds like the Pledge of Allegiance, doesn't it? But then I think about every human being's right to be at peace, to be free, and to be treated fairly. And I'm okay with it. And the 7th principle, and this came in the 80s with the respect of indigenous spirituality and the earth-based path. Respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. That's the 7 principles. These are not creeds. Unitarian Universalism is not a dogmatic religion. In fact, there's constant debate about those 7 principles and what they mean. The sources inspire me probably more than the principles do. No matter they say we're a non-dogmatic religion. The principles kind of feel like that to me sometimes, but the sources are where I found my greatest joy in being a Unitarian Universalist. And they are a direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Direct experience of mystery, being open to the wonder of life and the recreation of life. The words and deeds of prophetic women and men which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. We're challenged to do something. The 3rd source is the wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical and our spiritual life. The power of this simple sentence is, those wisdoms from the world's religions are the wisdom of humanity. Whether we relate to their God or a God, we can still relate to the wisdom of history captured in the words from the world's religions. A source that perhaps is the only source I don't quite relate to, because you have to consider the Unitarian and the Universalist Christian beginnings. This one is the Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. I'd be okay with that, by saying that the wisdom from all of the world's religions that call us to respond to the love of the divine by loving our neighbors as ourselves. But the selecting out the Jewish and the Christian is actually not something I've seen selected out specifically much as a declaration in UU churches. This source, the next to the last one, humanistic teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. Now, how's that? To a balance in consideration of the inspiration of religious words is to consider the power of reason and science. To me, that source is all about free will. Not taking anything because someone said it is true. The attitude of curiosity and personal exploration. And you might not be surprised that the last source is my favorite, the spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. There is within Unitarian Universalist a very active pagan collective. These are Unitarian Universalists who do use those sources as perhaps the most powerful in their own spiritual journey. The Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans. I've not joined it. I actually have some differences in philosophy with it, so it's not something that has appealed to me. I'm more purely a Unitarian Universalist in my fellowship, honoring all words of wisdom. I love it when every Sunday wise words are read from the pulpit that come from religious books, the Bible or the Quran, or that might be poetry, or quoting a Beatles song, or quoting something Albert Einstein reported. The sources of contemporary Unitarian Universalism are what holds me as part of the family. That's why I look forward to every Sunday, because you don't know what's going to inspire you in that Sunday. Maybe it'll be something you've never heard of or something you haven't considered. And you're always left, and you know me, if we worked in a student-teacher relationship, you're always left making of it what you will. It's not presented to you that it is. It's presented to you for consideration. Unitarian Universalist Church often have families that mom and moms or dads and dads might come from very different religious backgrounds individually. And they have decided that their children will find their own way in a loving community where they can explore what God or Goddess is or is not to them. I have had friends who were devout Jews, devout Hindus, devout Christians. Even a devout Roman Catholic sat next to me in church last Sunday, who are exploring what that can be in a wider world with the freedom of their engaging and questioning the religion of their families, the religion of their heritage, combining it with that feeling of relating to it as science and religion together in an environment that encourages that we question everything. We learn so much from each other. It's home to me because it doesn't tell you what to believe or what to do. It challenges you to think. It provide you constant insight and inspiration from the wisdom of all who have come before. Most, not all, but almost all Unitarian Universalist fellowships have undergone training to be a welcoming congregation. And if they have, you're going to see it on the sign for their church or their fellowship, however they've chosen to call themselves. And it is an awareness of, it started out when it was first happening, gay, lesbian, and transgendered issues, and of course now, it's embraced every possibility of what being a human might be. Here where I live, we happen to have a large gay and lesbian community. Unitarian Universalist churches were doing civil commitments and marriages before it could be legal, and they fight on the forefront of that effort continually. That's a very important part of who we are as a church, this welcoming of all the aspects of what a human being might be. I thought to end that discussion on Unitarian Universalist, the first thing is I suggest you go to the UUA website. It's uua.org. The principles and the sources are there. You get a chance to read and do what a UU would guide you to, is think what it might mean for you. If you are a lonely pagan, it's a great way to be someplace where even if you don't find somebody that thinks like you, you're going to find somebody that respects how you think. If you are someone raising a child and you'd like to raise that child in a more liberal religious environment, it's the place for you. They're scattered all throughout the United States. There might be one within driving distance from where you are. Sometimes they're a bit scattered according to the region. But I thought I'd end this with kind of a little list of some famous Unitarian Universalists. UUs tend to love to quote. Historically, people like Benjamin Franklin or George Washington or the Adams or all these older historical Unitarians, and then later on Universalists like E.E. Cummings and Thoreau, Herman Melville. I could go on and on. But I wanted to pick some more contemporary Unitarian Universalists after the merge. Because the thing about when you try to explain Unitarian Universalism is, it can be hard to explain because there's not a direct creed that says this is what I believe and it is what I do because I am a Unitarian Universalist. But it is what each individual UU does with their life that kind of gives you an idea what kind of people we are spiritually. And by spiritually, I am acknowledging those who are non-deists but who find the spiritual union with others and what you create out of that to be a higher purpose for living. So I thought I'd just mention some famous Unitarian Universalists that you might recognize. Oh, there's a lot more, but I just picked some. Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web. Ray Bradbury and Kurt Vonnegut. I think many of you will know Margot Adler. We love her and we miss her. If you're a little older, Steve Allen, the old talk show host, he was a very active Universalist. Albert Schweitzer. Get a load of this. Cher. Patty Duke. And in fact, Patty Duke's life has been focused on activism. That's why we haven't seen as much from her as we might have as an actress. Michael Learned, the mom on the Waltons, that was always trying to get her clan to go to church. Well, in real life, she would have been getting them to go to a Unitarian Universalist church. Clarence Darrow, Robert Foljam, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. Think of Paul Newman and Newman's own and his relationship to donation to charity. Frank Lloyd Wright, Sylvia Plath, May Sarton, my favorite poet, and Pete Seeger. I wanted to give you a little bit of variety of some of the more contemporary folks who are Unitarian Universalists. You don't see so much like in the new millennium kind of lists because we've gotten to be large enough as a religion that we're not getting that kind of, oh, it's so unique and odd to be one, so I'm going to declare that I am. You don't see as much the newer lists. And one I wanted to end with. When my family discovered I was a Unitarian Universalist, now I've explained to you in other videos that they don't understand what being a witch or a Wiccan is. I've chosen not to go there with them for many reasons I've shared. But I did share with them that I was involved in Unitarian Universalist fellowship. And my father was terribly concerned that I had joined a cult of some kind, because that sounded like some kind of a strange cult to him. Well, I sent him to the UUA website so he could look at it. He admitted he didn't find anything there that seemed particularly cultish. But then the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster occurred. So sad. And in that sad happenstance, Laurel Clark died, one of the astronauts. And there was a lot of coverage of her life. And I remember when I read it, because I didn't know that she was a UU, I sent my dad the link to the information about her and her local church and how she'd been involved and what it meant for her as a Unitarian Universalist to view the Earth from space and what she imagined that would be like. And my dad, who had been positive until that point that I was involved in some kind of a strange religious cult, decided if an astronaut could be a Unitarian Universalist, it must be a real religion. Oh, yes, bless him. So there's my long-promised video on what being a Unitarian Universalist means to me. Sorry for the history lesson, but it's in me to preach a little bit about the history and where we came from. And it informs who we are now, which is congregations that will be so different from congregation to congregation because the mix of people and their individual spiritualities or their philosophies and the way they live their life will be so different. There's things that we will all share, and yet we will always also be very, very different. Each congregation is very, very different. So in a way I proselytize like those early Universalists did. I found it to be a spiritual home that encouraged me to explore, to further define who I was and who I was in relation to. As a pagan woman, it was very helpful to me. Not only did it bring me out and into the wider community, who had never met one of us, who weren't quite so sure what I was at first, but who embraced me and learned from me, and therefore the exchange became I learned greatly from them. They accepted me before they even really knew what I believed in, because they had a sense I was coming from a place of love. The opportunities I've had to grow and mature within the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship have changed my life. I expect that to continue even now. One of the benefits to the fact that I have joined my local church is I will find myself once again with those who have a very different life experience and expectation even than I do. Younger people, older people, folks who have come from many different religions, and they're a UU for many different reasons. And I'll learn so much from them, and I won't stop growing because of that. It's home to me. We talk about often in the pagan path, when we found it, we felt like we'd come home. I felt, when it came to the pagan path, that I'd always been there. I didn't feel like I'd arrived anyplace. I have to admit, I felt like I arrived home when I settled into my first Unitarian Universalist fellowship. I felt truly I was with family members and kin. It defines who I am as much, if not more so, than that sometimes boxy feeling of what being a pagan might be. Because by nature, UU is not labeled or boxed. We don't even define ourselves individually or collectively. We're all about exploring who we are and not expecting the person next to us to be at the same place on their journey or to discover the same things. It has brought me into contact with many different religious practices and caused me to respect consideration of sources, the wonder and the magic and the love and the wisdom that is part of so many religions of the world. It's really turned me into a very ecumenical witch, and I'm deeply, truly grateful for it and for those I've met along my journey through UU fellowships. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask me. Most Unitarian Universalist fellowships have pretty darn awesome websites. We tend to be pretty tech savvy and use it. So you can explore not only UUA.org about the entire umbrella organization in the United States, and for those of you overseas, search it out. It's overseas too, it's not simply an American experience. Overseas there are still active Unitarians and active Universalists, and then there's Unitarian Universalist groups, and you will find them. They are scattered throughout the world. For those of you who are in America, go to the websites of all within drivable distance of your home if you're interested, because you'll pick up a sense of what their individual personalities are, to see if it might suit you or suit you and your family. So, consider that my bit of a journey into something that matters very greatly to me. Unitarian Universalism. I wish you all mirth and reverence. Mary Part.